Hello, my name is Linda Bobbitt, and I'll be talking to you about congregational vitality and the different dimensions associated with it over the course of a congregation's life. Most of this presentation will be by PowerPoint, but I wanted to say hello first. And so let's go ahead and get started. All right. So what are the dimensions of congregational vitality? Well, first we really need to understand what we mean by vitality itself. When I'm talking about vitality, I mean its ability to be missional over time. So it has to have mission and viability. By mission, I'm talking about the Great Commandment, and the Great Commission. It's how we relate to God, to each other, and the world. By viability, I mean that we can continue to do that over the future. So it's our finances, our critical mass of people, their energy, their commitment, and their hope. So when you combine those two things together, what we're saying is that we have a strong relationship with God and with each other, and we share that love with the world over time. Nancy Ammerman is a researcher in this area, and she defines it like this. She says, Christian churches exist to worship God, to teach and nurture people in the faith, and to spread the good news. Managing to gather an ongoing group of people who regularly do these things together is my definition of success. Well, you might be saying, okay, but what about growth? I mean, after all, when you hear pastors talking about how successful their congregation is, the first thing they say is, well, we've grown by X members. But the thing about it is researchers have looked into that. And growth isn't always associated with success. In fact, there are certainly healthy congregations that are growing, but there's also healthy congregations that aren't growing. And there's some unhealthy congregations who grow anyway. So some of the work I think is really informative is by some economists. They took a look at congregations from the perspective of clubs. They looked at social clubs as things that people voluntarily participate in and don't get paid to do. And from that perspective and the way you analyze club, they looked at congregations and they came to the understanding that there's such a thing as a right size for congregation. Now, the right size in a congregation or any other social organization is where the most people are able to contribute to that organization and receive the benefits of that organization. And if you're too small or not enough people, you get stretched really thin and people burn out. Or they just can't do enough of the thing the organization does to make the benefits worth participating. And then if you get too many people, you wind up with folks who are just not engaged. It's what they call free riders. And so every congregation they found has a right size for it, and that growth up until that point is healthy, but growth after that point becomes unhealthy. And so that's why you find a lot of healthy congregations aren't really growing because they've hit their right size, and then people kind of come in and go out around the same pace. And the right size for congregation varies by congregation, and it depends on a lot of different factors, including everything from the kind of area they're in, rural or urban or suburban, but also the infrastructure of the congregation, the various resources at hand, those kinds of things. So the reason I'm bringing this up is so that we can kind of put aside the idea that growth equals success. Growth is a factor in success, and it's important at different stages in life, but it's not synonymous with success. And so let's take a look at that. If we have a vital congregation, what are the factors that influence that? Well, there's an awful lot of literature out there, and I have taken the liberty of grouping it into 9 domains, into 9 different areas. And I'm going to go through each of these areas with you briefly. So the first area is programs. This is probably the most familiar. It's the stuff congregations do together. Okay, so they worship, they do faith formation, mission planning, youth, young adult activities, hospitality, evangelism, community outreach, stewardship, you name it, all the stuff congregations do. And there are millions of resources. In fact, there's whole doctorate degrees in some of these areas. And the basic assumption around all of this is that if a congregation does these things well, which means with intentionality and high quality and authenticity, then they'll thrive. That's kind of the underlying assumption behind all of these kinds of resources. But there's more to a vital congregation than just the things they do. There's also their actual resources. It's whether they have money, facilities, their technology, their people, their equipment, all that kind of stuff. And the assumption here is that if congregations have strong resources, they're more likely to thrive. If they have poor resources, they're going to struggle. And that resources can actually be a weight around their necks. Okay, and then we have administration and governance. And here, it's their ability to make decisions, to manage their finances and their personnel, to do communication. And the assumption here is that if the congregations run well, then it can be nimble enough to adapt as needed with changing contexts and therefore remain vital. Another domain is the attitudes or the culture of the congregation. This is things like how they engage with each other. It's their sense of family and belonging. It's their willingness to change, how they fight with each other, what they expect of each other, and how they hold each other accountable, those kinds of things. And here, the assumption is that if they have the right attitudes and culture, that they'll be able to make changes that they need to thrive. So there's a lot of resources and literature about that, especially around the issue of change and willingness to change, but also the health of the family. So now here, local context is the next one, and this has two parts. One of it is how engaged the congregation is in their local community, and the second part is the description of the community itself. So the assumptions here are that if a congregation accompanies their community, they don't just do things at it or in isolation from it, and the congregation itself reflects the community, then they'll thrive. And then the other part is that congregations that are in communities that have strong economic or demographic growth, they're going to have an advantage. So where the congregation is matters. Small rural is different than suburban, is different than urban, etc. Okay. Leadership. Here there's a lot of leadership literature out there, and by leadership I'm talking about both the pastor and the professional staff, but also the lay leadership and the informal leaders. Each of these is important to the congregation's vitality. And what's important about the leadership? Well, it's their skill set, it's their personality characteristics, and it's also their health. And by health, I mean every aspect of health: emotional, physical, behavior, all the kinds of health you can think of. And here the assumption is that if the lay and rostered leaders have strong skills, appropriate personalities, and they're healthy, then we'll thrive. And a lot of times the solution to an ailing congregation is to stick a new pastor in. So that's this mentality that leadership is what matters. And the other piece of it is that the informal leaders are really important. They can either be really helpful or really harmful sometimes, especially in the smaller congregations where they have more influence. Another domain is relationships, and a lot of that is the relationships among the leadership. Here the assumptions are that if we get along well and we support each other, then we will work together and we'll thrive. Okay. And then our last domains are mission and purpose. This is the idea of the congregation's sense of purpose. Where is God calling them in the here and now? And the assumption is that congregations that are centered on God's mission will focus their energy more strategically. They'll stay on task and they'll stay missional. The accompanying piece, there's a little less information about this, but it is definitely a strong thread, and that is the idea that how the congregation experiences God in their day-to-day life matters. If they sense that God is active and has a presence in their life together, then they can trust God's leadership and they'll walk into the future with God. Some congregations do that well. A lot of congregations see God as kind of out there in heaven somewhere, and they think God has a purpose for them. They have to discern it, but by discern they sort of mean psychically connect or guess at what God wants them to do, and then go about doing it on their own and hope that God's happy with it. That's very disconnected compared to the preferred understanding here. And then some congregations honestly don't have any idea what God wants from them and haven't really thought much about it. It's just not really on their radar. Now what undergirds this whole thing is theology. How the congregation understands its God and the nature of God is going to drive these two things quite a bit. And so having a clearly articulated theology, that's really grounded in the relationship that God has with the congregation and with the members themselves, with individuals, with God, each other, and the world. How does God relate to all those things? So the relational aspect of theology is what matters here, and that's going to drive both of these issues. Okay, so now we've described each of those domains, and as you can see, all of them are important in a congregation's life, but how do they relate to each other and make up a vital or not so vital congregation? Well, there's actually several schools of thought on that. The first one focuses on the individual domains, and that's most of the literature out there. Everything from systems theory to leadership models to stewardship, you name it. Most of them say, they kind of look through the lens of that one and they say this is what matters. And they don't really talk about the other ones. But there's another body of literature that looks at the cumulative effect of these different domains. And they would say that as you gather strengths in more and more areas, you're more likely to be a vital congregation. And it's all about how many. That's like your NCD model, where they're building up the wine barrel and having the slots all about the right height and keep to building them up. Martinson also found the same thing when he looked at youth and family practices in strong congregations, is that the stronger ones had a kind of accumulated number of strengths in the various areas across domains, and that there was a tipping point. When you hit that, you were more likely to be healthier in general. But there's another theory that talks about the concept of being necessary but not sufficient. And that's where they would say, you know, it's not just so much about how many domains you have in your, strengths you have in your favor. It's that certain ones are more important than others. And those certain ones might be things like mission or leadership or relationships, and that you have to have those. And if you don't have those, all the other ones won't help you a bit. Unfortunately, those theories usually compete with each other to say which ones are the necessary ones. And so I'm working on a model of understanding how these things relate to each other, and this is my working theory that I'd like to share with you. Here's all our domains, and they're kind of stacked on each other, and they're kind of stacked like Jenga blocks. This is the analogy I'm going to use for this presentation. So if you're familiar with Jenga, the blocks come out of the box kind of piled like this in alternating rows. Some of them are going horizontal. I don't know, they're all horizontal, but some are from left to right and some are from right to left, so they stack. And because of this pattern, you can poke out certain blocks, and then the idea of the game is you remove them and then you stack them on top. So you're constantly rebuilding the tower from the bottom up, which is kind of a neat analogy. Now the nature of the game is that as you rebuild the tower, it becomes less and less stable because you're removing some of these foundational blocks. And so what you find is that eventually they fall over, and whoever has that happen when they're on their turn, they lose. But the analogy goes a little ways. So let's talk a little more about how that might look with our domains. So here's the domains over here. And I put them in this order for a reason. It's because there is a relationship. If you understand the table they're sitting on is your core theology as a congregation, and then you look at the mission and purpose and their sense of God's presence, those things are going to really drive what attitudes and cultures that they have. And those will also drive how they relate to their local context, right? So if you have a missional congregation that's really all about the Great Commission, they're going to have very different attitudes and a very different relationship in their local context than the congregations who, for example, were started with the primary understanding that we're going to stick a flag in the ground and this is where the Lutherans are going to gather. And then the Lutherans gather and enjoy each other's time. And then their culture and attitudes are going to be much more about serving the members in the congregation than they are going to be about connecting with their local context. And then those attitudes and the context are going to drive the programs for the same reason, right? If we're here for each other, then we're going to create programs for each other. If we're here for the community, we're going to create programs that connect to the community. And then when you look at the blocks that go across-wise, that's what these ones are, you can see that the relationships between the leadership and the skills of the leaders themselves are going to drive how well the congregation can manage resources and do governance, make decisions and manage their stuff. So there is a strong relationship here, and it has to do with every other row, and that's kind of the nature of the Jenga blocks. So now let's say, okay, let's say this is true. And then we might say, well, how does that apply to congregations? Well, at first you might say, well, it applies to all congregations. All congregations need to have this foundation, and they all relate the same. And I thought that was true until I started visiting congregations. And I found that, well, certain things were more important in some congregations than others. So I started looking into why that might be. And I found that organizational development matters. So let me share with you one particular theory that's really simple and kind of lays the groundwork. This is by Hannon. He described 5 different concepts associated with organizational mortality. So he wasn't looking at congregations, he was looking at organizations in general. And he was challenging the assumption that as organizations get old, they get more fragile and they die. And that makes sense, because if you think about it, organizations aren't the same as organic life forms, right? Human beings, for example, or any organic life form, it's born, it has a lifespan, it gets old, it starts to lose its vitality, and it dies. And there's not much you can do about that. There's not a lot of 200-year-old people out there. But organizations aren't the same. They also, of course, age over time, but what is that aging about? Because it's not biological. And so that's what Hannon was looking at. And he found these 5 different concepts, right? So the first one was endowment. What resources does the organization have? The second one was this concept of imprinting. That is, early in a organization's life, certain attitudes or cultures or behaviors are adopted, and sometimes they get imprinted in such a way that they kind of stick. So then what happens is, over time, the organization gets stuck in inertia, meaning it can't change those cultural behaviors and attitudes. And that affects its capability to do its mission effectively, because it's so encrusted by those imprinted ideas. And all of that relates mostly to this idea of position. That's the influence it has on the local community and its reputation in the local community. So if you're thinking about a business, for example, it's what is its market share, but also what is its reputation. And what Hannon found is that the age of a congregation really is tracking the fit between the organization and its environment. I mean, think about all the different technologies that have come and gone in the various years. What about Sony, who created Walkmans? They could have had the market on all, all future media for listening to songs, and yet they didn't, because they couldn't get their mind out of this hand-carried cassette thing. They got imprinted with some of those attitudes about the importance of hardware and that type of hardware, and they weren't able to keep up with the changing in their environment. So that was what Hannon presented, and it got me thinking about congregations and how they change over time. He found that basically organizations, they wind up being either fragile or robust from the onset, depending on how they develop those early cultures. And that is what really dictated mortality, not so much their age. And he also noted that it takes longer to develop a healthy organization from the start, but it's worth it because they'll last a lot longer. And then Doherty applied that theory to congregations themselves, and he found that there's 2 really critical times in a congregation's life, and those times are the first few years of the congregation as they're forming, and then when they do their generational transitions. So that's usually around 40 and about 75 years. The idea here is that when an organization's formed, all its cultures and programs and all that stuff on those piles of Jenga blocks are formed with the founding members in mind. That's kind of who does it, so that's who needs its meeting. And if it's done correctly, it's done kind of with an eye to the future and the eye to who's not there yet. But if it's not done correctly, it's pretty much done for the people who are there. Then when you get to the second generation, those folks might take it over and do it in the same kind of way to keep their parents happy. But by the time you get to the third generation, they really don't care, and they're so disconnected from that first generation that it all basically falls apart. However, if you've built it in such a way that that it's more about mission and more about looking forward and outward, then each generation can embrace it for themselves. And so I'm going to be applying these theories to how that affects a congregation as it ages over time. But there's one more theory I'm going to bring into the picture, and that is another developmental theory from the human development perspective, and that would be Erik Erikson. You might be familiar with him. He's kind of foundational human development person who proposed various stages of human development. And what's interesting about his theory is that at each stage, every person has certain developmental tasks that they have to address. And there's a potential for both a positive or a negative outcome at each stage. Now, for example, infants, when you're born, you will learn to either trust adults or distrust adults. If you learn to trust adults, your next tasks in future stages are going to be easier. If you learn to distrust adults, it kind of puts you at a disadvantage. Doesn't mean you're doomed to fail. It makes it a lot harder to have a positive outcome later. And he proved that over time. The researcher called Fowler took that idea of Erikson's theory, and he looked at what developmental stage people in congregations were and what that meant for how they interacted, which is really fascinating. But that's not actually what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about the same idea of having positive and negative outcomes for each stage of a congregation's life and how that might move them using Hannon's ideas, how that might move them through their developmental cycle. And so here is the developmental cycle. We start out as a new congregation, we form, we're learning, at some point we become sustainable on our own. Then we become mature. And again, if you're doing it right and you've got all of those things going for you, you're going to keep moving up here. If you have problems, you'll backslide a little bit. Now when you hit maturity, because congregations are not biological, you can actually stay here for a while, and here's how you do it, is every so often you'll hit maturity, you'll stabilize for a while, you'll kind of plateau, and you'll start to decline, and you'll figure out something's, the world has moved on and we need to adjust. And so you'll redefine yourself, and you'll move right over here into the more creative side, and the whole cycle goes again and again. Congregations can stay there for hundreds of years, and they have. And so that would be a healthy outcome of maturity, is to kind of stay up here. But at some point, according to Hannon, organizations or congregations don't do that. They start to move down. They get a little stuck, but there's still hope. There's a point here where they're still sustainable, where they can renew themselves. This is a bigger reboot here. It requires going all the way back to the formation stage, where you're kind of reimagining who you are and what you need to be in this new context, but it can absolutely be done. And then the struggle stage, you wind up basically closing the organization and then starting over with those resources in a new way. And so this model here of development, this is Rothage's model, but there's quite a few others. Some have 8 stages, some have however many, but this is the simple one. So in a minute, I'm going to go through each stage and talk about how the dimensions of vitality fit in each stage. But before we do that, let's just take a minute and look at our handout. What I want you to do is take a break, pause the video if you like, but go ahead and take a look at this handout. Think about your own context. And do a couple things. I want you to shape these boxes according to how strong or weak you see these in your own context, okay? And then put a little star or asterisk or circle or something by the box where you as a leader in your congregation are spending most of your time and energy. It might be more than one box, but put some asterisks there. Next, go down to this bell curve, which is the same as the one I just showed you, except it's on one page, so the loops go this way, but you get the idea. And put a little X where you see your congregation right now. And think about what all this tells you about your own ministry. So go ahead and pause and do that, and then come right back to the video. Okay. That's all right. I'll get back to where we were. So let's go through each of these stages now. When you're at a new start, Your congregation's busy inviting, it's beginning to worship together, and it's creating a new community of faith. And the most important things you're doing are these bottom blocks here. You are laying the groundwork. It's about relationships and mission and presence, and remember, all that is undergirded by strong theology, okay? The key tasks here are creating a supportive Christian community and establishing your initial missiology and your sense of God's presence. And the practices you're doing, well, you're involved in worship and community building and sharing your faith and reaching out to new people because you've got to be growing here. There's dangers. The main danger is that you lack the resources or fail to create the community. Another danger is that you might create a community that's based on poor missiology, not really God-centered. So the role of the leadership here is to be, they're really a strong leader. They have vision, they have excitement, empowerment. They're connecting the community, they're recruiting new members. And if all goes well, they'll continue growing. Just think about Acts and how Paul started new churches, or even Joshua coming in with the people into the promised land. What I like about that example is they're setting up their new culture in a new place, and they're in a community it's pretty countercultural compared to the rest of the community. So they're having to establish who are we, how are we about God, and how is God here with us in this new place. If it doesn't work, the negative is that it just won't get off the ground, or it'll establish a really weak foundation. So imagine our Jenga blocks, and instead of these nice big blocks, imagine that they're round or they're really small. That just makes you more fragile from the get-go. Okay, next we have the formation and learning. Okay, so here we have a church that's growing, it's getting organized, and it's becoming self-sustaining. The key tasks here are to establish your healthy congregation attitude. So you're now working on this next block set up here, okay? So it's your initial ecclesiology or your structures. And it's also doing more evangelism and recruitment. Here you've got to have the strong leadership and relationships as are kind of still developing because you're adding more people all the time. The practices, well, you're still doing those first things. You're still worshiping and stuff, but you're also creating administration. You're building lay leadership up. You're doing discipleship. You're training people as disciples. You're talking about spirituality and doing growth, and you're setting up hospitality and still doing evangelism. And these are really important practices because you're making church about church and about God. The dangers are that you fail to gain critical mass or enough resources, or that you imprint an unhealthy culture. So the role of leadership here, still very strong. It's to create lay capacity, to develop programs, to stay missional. They've got to keep the eye on that prize. A positive example is that you grow into maturity, and Philippians is a good example of that, just the church in Philippians and how it got off to a good start. The negative example would be that you backslide or you establish an unhealthy culture. And I used Corinthians as the example there because Paul found some potential problems with how they were setting up an unhealthy culture and expectations. Okay, now let's say you're successful and you move into maturity. Here you can say we've already got the nice strong foundation here, and we're working up here, and this is the part that's our moving bits. So we are now a community that's living its faith and adapting with the context. The key theological task is really to focus on creating disciples and leaders. That's what we're all about here. The practices, well, it's about faith formation and spiritual practices for all ages. It can't just be kids, because we know that adults the faith of the adults is what drives the faith of the children. So if you want to make those generational transitions work, you're going to have strong spiritual practices for adults. Stay deep, celebrate, talk about your faith, but also create strong other programs, youth programs, governance, administration, stewardship, and all those kinds of things. Manage your facilities well, do all that stuff. That's when all the blocks come into play. The dangers here is that you become disconnected from the community, or you get rigid or bureaucratic, and you focus on yourself. There's also a dangerous time at this generational transition. So the role of the leadership here changes a bit. It becomes a lot more collaborative. Here the pastor is really focused on being the spiritual leader. focusing on God's mission and God being present. And it's the lay leaders who kind of run the business side. I'm not saying the pastor's not involved in the business side. They absolutely are, but they aren't driving it the way they did in the previous stages. A positive example of what a mature organization looks like, congregation looks like, I think, can be found in Kings, with the time of King David and Samuel, and they built the temple and all that stuff. Negative example might be looking at Jerusalem during Jesus' time, for example. Jesus was constantly railing against the church, the synagogues, and how rigid they become. They were so focused on their rules that they'd forgotten the missional purpose behind the rules. So they were all, they had basically imprinted the wrong culture and were no longer missional. Now, if you, as I mentioned before, if you stay mature, you can be in this stage for a long time, but at some point, these things will come and get you. So you'll find yourself in decline, and that's when programs become less important and some of this other stuff gets more shaky. So decline is, it's about losing members, money, energy, mission, and becoming detached from the community. Here, the key theological tasks are to renew that sense of missiology and reconnect with God. That's your basic task. But also, usually by the time you're in decline, the congregation's been through some kind of trauma, and there's usually a need for confession and forgiveness and reconciliation. And when I'm putting it this way, it's because it really has to be liturgical and communal. It can't just be a couple people saying they're sorry. But by doing it in that way, we're reconnecting people with God and mission, and we're able to corporately move on. What practices? Well, there's actually quite a lot. I couldn't fit on the slide, but I have a handout, and it's in the annotated bibliography. But it describes 8 different kinds of practices associated with turning churches around that have to do with these things here, especially focusing on the missiology, confession, and forgiveness, and kind of putting the structures back in place and prioritizing tasks. The danger, of course, is that the congregation will remain focused on survival and not mission, or even just focused on themselves and not mission. They'll lose critical mass and they'll fall into conflict, or the conflict will be what drags them down. The role of leadership here, first of all, create a sense of urgency so people are willing to change. And in doing so, you have to relate to people's heads, their hearts, and their hands. So in their heads, it's intellectual. Yes, we need to do this, we're running out of money or people or whatever. Their hearts, it's emotional, connect to their hearts. And then their hands, give them something to do where you can have short-term success. And then it feels like it's doable, and you'll make progress. But leadership also needs to focus on either restoring or maybe just establishing a new missiology. They have to focus on healing and reconciliation. They have to do some role clarification, because by now there's usually some problems with that, the role of leadership. They have to also address whatever cultural blocks there are, any dysfunction there is. They have to prioritize activities. And finally, they have to reintroduce the congregation to the neighborhood that they're in, because usually they've become pretty disconnected by now. So a positive example of this, I think, can be found in 1 and 2 Samuel, as Israel changed governance from their old judges model into the new king's model. They really kind of had to push the reset button for themselves. They had a new way of organizing themselves and a new vision for how they did mission as a body. And then the negative example is, if you're not able to do this, then you'll kind of have this downward spiral until you're unsustainable. And I use Judges as that, because if you look at the pattern in Judges, the people would be kind of self-centered. They'd get a little bit arrogant maybe. They'd wind up getting in trouble. Then they'd go begging to God, oh, help us, and God would help out, and there's a judge, and for a little while it's better. But then the judge dies, and everything kind of goes back to how it was, only a little worse. So they kind of go down, each cycle down a little bit further, down a little bit further. And that kind of cycle is what decline often looks like. It's not just straight down. It's up, 1 step forward, 2 steps back. Okay, finally, struggle. Here, a lot of the programming and this kind of stuff's falling apart. This is when a congregation is no longer self-sustaining, and really closure's the only option, because renewing a congregation takes a lot of resources, and these folks just don't have them. So the key tasks here It's to let go of the need to control and to trust God's promise of resurrection. And the practice here needs to focus on things like prayer, reconciliation, celebrating life that they've had as a congregation, and making some administrative decisions. The threat here is that they'll stay in denial, they'll refuse to plan, and they'll fail to reconcile, and then one day they just won't have money to pay the bills. The pastor will move on and someone will lock up the building, or the synod will take it over in synodical administration or something like that. The role of the leadership here is really focused on healing, on accompaniment. They have to accompany the congregation. Rothage calls them kind of a parent, kind of lead them through this process, like you might lead a child through a process. I don't know, that seems a little patronizing to me, but you get the idea. It's about planning with the congregation, helping them pray, reconcile, celebrate, and imagine a new life somewhere else as they move to other congregations. I was just at a congregation a few weeks ago that was in this position, and they were very much in denial, but once we walked with them for the weekend and talked to them about their situation and said, you know, we don't think it's reasonable to reestablish this congregation at this time because they just didn't have critical mass or energy. And we had them imagine, what would it be like to go to church on Sunday and see your friends and just get to be at church and not have to worry about whether you'd be here next week and not have to stand up in front of the congregation and ask for more money. And not, you know, what would that be like? And you should have seen their faces. They kind of glazed over and smiled and said, oh, it would be such a relief to be part of another congregation and not have to have this huge weight on my shoulder anymore. And so they have since decided to close, actually, so they'll be moving forward. And that's what a positive outcome is, because remember, God works through resurrection, and so if we have holy closure and we complete one ministry, we can start a new one in a different way, in a different place, using the same resources. So here I used Acts and Pentecost as an example. Jesus' earthly ministry was over, but those same resources, those disciples, were able to start a new and different kind of ministry in a new and different kind of way, using those teachings and resources and the Spirit. On the other hand, a negative one would be the example of what happened to Israel and Judah after they were, you know, kind of fell apart and captured and hauled off to exile. All their stuff was lost and looted. So that's a negative example of how you might resolve this stage. So that is a look through all the different stages. And if you think about how these domains work, you can see there's a building up and then kind of a falling down of them. If you look about it, outside and internal forces affect it. This cat here, if you ever have a chance to look at the video, you could Google cat and Jenga. This cat actually doesn't knock over the whole thing. He pulls out individual blocks and moves them around. It's hilarious. But the point here of the cat is that there's forces that impact it. What matters, though, is the strength, the critical strength of the table it sits on, which is your theology, but also the strength of some of these lower blocks. If you build strong, steady blocks, you're going to be a lot more stable. If you build weak, tiny, or round blocks, you're going to fall apart the first time something jostles you. But also, it's to remember that a gentle touch is required as a leader inside or from the outside. So let's talk about what kinds of change might be able to be made in different places. First of all, there's something called technical change. These are tweaks to the system that are designed to fix a problem. It's how can we do things differently? That's the question. The next kind of change is called adaptive change. This is asking different questions like, what are we doing this? Why are we doing this? And is this still what we need to be doing? And so technical change can be done up here in these upper blocks. But if you're going to be messing with these lower blocks, you need to be thinking adaptive change. Now let's put that in the context of the life cycle. So remember our life cycle? Think about where you put your congregation on the life cycle. And now look at this little line here. This is the line of creativity. On the left-hand side, we have a creative organization where they're able to make changes more easily. And on the right-hand side, things have gotten kind of rigid. It's a lot harder to change things. And what we see is that technical change can be done here on the left. That's the time for technical changes. But if you're over here, you need to be thinking about adaptive changes. And so what are the implications for your congregation? Well, there's several. First of all, you need to determine where you are in the cycle. Then you need to review the critical tasks and the role of the leader. You need to seek out resources and changes that are appropriate for your place in the cycle. And you need to attend to all of the different domains. Don't just ignore them or work on your favorite, but attend to all of them. And especially focus on how solid the base is. You need to create realistic expectations. If you're in a declining congregation, technical changes probably aren't going to work. You need to do bigger ones. You need to trust God. You need to pray and do your biblical work and listen a lot as a leader. It's important to take the time to stay grounded yourself. And then it's really important for you to help your congregation understand that every single stage here, including the struggling stage, provides an opportunity for faithful response to God's mission. None of these is failure. There is a graceful, faithful way through each one, and every congregation at some point in its life will be at every stage. There are no congregations around that were started by St. Paul back in the day. And so don't be discouraged about the stage you're in. Don't feel like a failure. Just look for what is the faithful response to God's mission at this stage in this time. And I think after all of this, what I'd like you to do is go back and think about where you marked your congregation on the handy-dandy resource. And given all that you've just learned, what do you think you should be working on? Compare the asterisks you marked up here and where you think the strength is. And ask yourself where you should be focused and what's next for you. Thank you very much for your time.